Welcome back to the Druid Newsletter. Today we're going to be discussing the summary of the English Civil War, the effects it had on the North East, and most important of all, who are the people that influence these effects. And here we have Charles I. What about him? He tried to usurp the power of the Parliament, but most important of all, tried to equal the rights between the Catholics and the Protestants.
Oh, you've caught me. Would you like to tell me your name and role?
My name is John Sadler. I'm a military historian. I'm a very well published author. I'm a lecturer. I was for 28 years a lecturer at what was the School of Lifelong Learning, Newcastle University. When the war began in 1642, the people in charge of the parliamentary faction, people like Pym and Essex, Earl of Manchester, they were not seeking regime change. They were conservative. What they wanted was to curb the royal prerogative, to bring the king to heel, to make the king effectively more subservient to the rule of Parliament. That was what they were after. So they were oligarchs rather than democrats. As the wars dragged on, attitudes hardened, and a new, if you like, generation of younger men came prominent in the parliamentarian armies, Cromwell being the obvious example, and generals like Lambert, Ireton, who were much more hardline, much more radical, and who began, after the surrender of the king in 1646, to think increasingly in terms of a republic, try to do away with the monarchy altogether, which had not been Parliament's original aim. The king, who simply couldn't be trusted, who intrigued with everybody against anybody, made his own position impossible, but there was still a lot of unease in the country in 1649 when Parliament, having tried the king, decided to execute him. A lot of people thought that was judicial murder, and the Parliament didn't actually have the authority to execute the king. And the Scots estates, Charles was King of Scotland, he was a Stuart as well, they were appalled at the fact that the English Parliament cut their king's head off without actually asking him. So the regicide did harden attitudes quite a lot, and of course Cromwell's time as Lord Protector was an experiment in republicanism. It didn't work.
Which faction do you think had the most effect on the North East?
Initially, that was quite clearly the Royalists. The North East was held very firmly for the king by William Cavendish, the Marquess of Newcastle. So it's fair to say that the North East was a major Royalist area. Newcastle was a major Royalist bastion. It was the only major East Coast port which the Royalists controlled. And then obviously you had the Scots influence, the Presbyterians, the Scots. Briefly occupied Newcastle and Battle of Newburn in 1640, and then occupied Scotland and Newcastle until 1646, after they'd taken the city in 1644. So again, there was a Presbyterian influence.
After the siege of Newcastle Castle, we've learned the Royalist forces surrendered to the Scottish Covenant. Problem is, this had a massive effect on the North East people.
Do you think there are any social or economic effects?
There's no question that there were major economic effects. The siege of Newcastle in 1644, in the late summer, early autumn, was followed by bad weather and almost famine. So there were massive economic issues. During the war itself, Newcastle was the major exporter of coal. London got all its coal from Newcastle. And with the Royalists in control, the coal supply was shut off. Sir John Marley, who was the mayor of Newcastle, did not send any coal to London. It was a major issue for Parliament. It also, of course, impacted on the economy of the North East because he weren't able to sell the coal. So yes, there were significant economic consequences. Social consequences are harder to measure. In 1660, Sir John Marley, who had been in exile, came back. This social order didn't appear to be affected at all. So as far as we're aware, there weren't any major social changes. The impacts, I think it's fair to say, were more economic. As we said, the Scots behaved very well. There wasn't widespread looting or pillaging. There wasn't any widespread retribution against the Royalists. But the Scots stayed in occupation of Newcastle because the money which the English parliamentarian government owed them was still outstanding. The Scots were there really effectively as mercenaries.
Right, and as you said, they behave very well, but were there other armies that behave poorly, like Newton and...
Yeah, certainly, generally speaking, there were the armies bystanders of the day not behave as badly as the armies did in Germany, but there were, on both sides, a number of atrocities. Obviously, you hear all about the atrocities committed by Cromwell's forces in Ireland, 1649. But at the Battle of Naseby in 1645, a large number of women camp followers, most of them Welsh, were deliberately killed, targeted and killed by parliamentarian cavalry. That was because they thought they were Irish, because they were speaking Welsh Gaelic, which to a parliamentarian sounded like Irish Gaelic. So they murdered and mutilated quite a lot of women. That was a particularly nasty incident. And there were others. The Royalists were by no means free of guilt either. So yes, there were atrocities, and both armies at times were capable of behaving very badly.
Thank you for watching, but of course I have to include my own opinion. Basically, I do believe Charles I was a bit lenient and his actions were somewhat justified. Then again, that grueling decade war against the parliamentarians, including the fact that he had fought the Scottish Guard, and also some brutal actions against Irish people, I would have to say that, frankly, the war has both bad sides but also good sides. But even after the end of the war, the parliamentarians enacted famine and widespread poverty across the northeast. Now, thank you for watching, and hope you come back.
In 1642, I knew what I had to do. Leave my home and family too, and fight for good old Charlie. Turn